Mic check. All right. So we are live for this particular segment of this content that is about to get real hot and explosive because we're going to go over why, out of all people, why Conor McGregor is not going to be in UFC 300. First of all, like at first they were planning on putting him into that particular card, which by the way is big in and of itself, right? It's the every 100 card that they have going on, and they want to make it special. So who better than Conor McGregor to put in that card? Now, it seems that they're sort of retracting back on that particular decision because a big part of it is because they're trying to fill up that card with championship fights. So if that's what you're trying to do, then you don't really need Conor McGregor. You can sort of put him in a different card. And by the way, spread the wealth out in terms of pay per view sales. Because let's say you put on 4 championship fights that have nothing to do with Conor or Michael Chandler. Well, some of the advantages that you could have with that is they're going to at the very least, hit just right under a million. I'm talking about 4 championship fights. And what do I mean by that? Maybe 800,000 buys, 900,000 buys, something to that extent. Then in comes Conor, an automatic million, and it all depends on the type of dance partner that he has. Now, obviously, he's done great numbers with Dustin Poirier, definitely did great numbers with Khabib because it took two for them to tango on that end. But with Michael Chandler, you're sort of increasing the quarterly rate of the UFC's revenue in that particular time period. Because as you know, corporations and companies, especially big time billion-dollar companies like this, they like to go over, let's say, their quarterly income and the revenues that they make at a certain period of time during the year and compare and contrast. So, what better way to, let's say, spread the wealth, as I was just saying earlier, by having Conor McGregor fight maybe somewhere in the summertime and then make a bank load of money on the UFC 300 name and the UFC 300 hype somewhere in March and then just continue on the hype train from there. So, that's not so much what we're really going to talk about that is an explosive part of this conversation, but rather the most explosive part of this particular topic is really about understanding Conor McGregor's mental health. Now, here's the thing. You read a title like this, you think to yourself, great, another content that deals with Conor McGregor. The reality is that even though you're in a business where you're talking about other people and what it is that they do and how you can, let's say, convey that in a mixed martial arts story, what you're really going through and what you're really doing is giving life lessons to people. It just so happens that you're using some of the biggest figures in a sport of mixed martial arts or in entertainment to try and convey these stories, these lessons that you can learn from. And guess what? Conor McGregor, I got to tell you, his entire life is an entire lesson in and of itself. There's a lot of gems that you can really learn from Conor McGregor's life. For one, you can understand and really draw comparisons into how, let's say, somebody who grew up with absolutely nothing, and I guess in the standards of the West, you could call a working class background, though hard in comparison to, let's say, anybody that lives in a Western world, but probably more of a luxury to the comparison of, let's say, somebody like Francis Ngannou. Nonetheless, it's all relative in how you convey or view the world around you, right? So obviously for Conor, this was a very tough life for him becoming a plumber. He didn't want to do that, so it motivated him to become who he is. So you can draw comparisons to this and really draw inspirations more than anything. You're in a job you don't like, and all of a sudden you decide you want to do something about it. This is sort of the quintessential reason why Conor McGregor has become the Irish working class background hero to that society. Because now all the other lads that are from that part of the world can look at that and say to themselves, you know what? I can draw inspiration from this. I can draw a sense of positivity from this. I can draw a sense of saying to myself, you know what? In the hardest times that I'm going through in my life, I can make it because this guy made it. So it's a great type of yeah, a great type of example that you can see if, let's say, you are from that part of the world that he's from. So, lo and behold, he accomplishes his dreams, and all of a sudden, one of the worst things that can happen to you, as according to Mike Tyson, he says that sometimes God actually gives you exactly what it is that you want and that you pray for just to see if you can handle it. And even Khabib has mentioned this about Conor McGregor. He says that Allah has blessed him. And now the test is, what are you going to do with that blessing? Well, unfortunately, the way that you see things is that many of us really can easily fall victims of ourselves in terms of losing a sense of humility if, let's say, we reach a certain pinnacle in our life or a certain goal that we've reached in a career or something to that extent, right? What you get out of that is just sometimes getting a little too ahead of yourself. And that's kind of what we're seeing with Conor in this current moment of time. And at the same time, as I have mentioned in the last video that I'm going to play for you right now, Conor McGregor is in this situation where it's going to be very difficult for him to develop as a fighter because of how he is marketed into the bigger stratosphere of the world of mixed martial arts, and the fact that he just can't go out there and just take any old fights, that the UFC has to somehow gain something from it rather than trying to gain something from himself. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about right here. I'm going to play this for a bit so you can get an understanding and a context to what I was talking. Victim of their own success is the way that we can describe Conor McGregor in his current moment in time, who, by the way, has not fought since July of 21. And why is that a problem? Well, for one, the inactivity can only hurt you in the world of mixed martial arts. But we also have to ask, why is there a negativity and a large gap in Conor McGregor, as if to say you can compare it to an employee that has huge gaps in between the years that he hasn't worked in his resume. So this is one way that we can really describe Conor McGregor in terms of what is going on with him in the current moment of time. And then you have the situation where he was supposed to be scheduled for UFC 300 only to be taken out, with many speculations leading towards mental health crisis and any other types of possible accusations you could throw at him that he's been getting over the years, from the time that he supposedly attacked Machine Gun Kelly back in 21 at the Grammys, the time that he got into it with the DJ in Italy when he basically punched him in the middle of a party, and then he got into it with that kid in Miami that was a British citizen that tried to take a picture with him, or tried to take a picture of Conor in a very compromised situation, and went out and smashed his phone. And then in the recent times, you have that situation in Miami where he went into a bathroom with a girl only to do coke, and among other things. The list can go on with Conor McGregor and all these different mishaps that he's experienced off the octagon. But the one thing that you can definitely guarantee is that when this guy is not in there having a purpose and doesn't have a scheduled event, he goes off the rails. And rightfully so, because you have to understand, in order to make a Conor McGregor fight, there's a lot of things that go into it. In the pandemic, he wasn't able to go out there and perform because the UFC did not want to allow him to fight with nobody in the crowd and in a way that they can't make even more money out of it. So they waited until January of 21 for him to step in there with a crowd in Abu Dhabi against Dustin Poirier, and then only to do it again the following summer right after that. So now he's in this situation where he's taken out of UFC 300, and it's going to be 3 years since he hasn't fought. So with all this information that I had thrown at you for the last whole 3 minutes of this entire video as of this current moment of time, you got to ask yourself, is Conor McGregor a victim of his own success? Yeah, and that's sort of the big question that we are asking here: is he a victim of his own success? Because obviously he wants to get better in his craft after the loss that he took to Khabib, and then the 2 consecutive losses he took to Dustin Poirier. So something has to change, but one of those solutions is something that is hard to fulfill because of the fact that it's hard to get him fights, and it's hard to put him in certain positions that may not be lucrative for the UFC. So in other words, they can't just go in there and throw him up against Diego Sanchez or some random name or something like that, maybe even Clay Guida, They can't do that. They have to maximize the profit that they can out of him. And guess what? That's kind of the reason why you're not going to see Conor McGregor take any of these tune up fights. But back to this video.
And right now, the answer is yes. You can't deny that. The UFC can't make a fight without having to create all this insane, extravagant event around Conor McGregor, and every time it has to be a WrestleMania.
Yep.
You got to understand, there's a certain baseline that goes into, let's say, content, views, ratings, and things of that nature. For example, back in the days when you watched Saved by the Bell, okay, there's going to be ups and downs. Some people are not going to be able to watch the entire series or every episode based on whatever week is to come or whatever type of content is within that episode. For example, if you remember, one of the biggest episodes of Saved by the Bell was the episode where Jesse Spanos had some sort of issues with caffeine pills, as innocent as that sounds in the 90s, trying to somehow reference drug use in a very innocent way. But neither here or there. Obviously, that particular show brought a lot of awareness to different types of substance abuses, and also the fact that the 90s was obsessed with the dare idea of having a war on drugs and having this Ronald Reagan ethos and narrative being punched into the edge.
So basically, what I'm going on about there is trying to make you understand that the UFC has to work under a quarterly, as I mentioned earlier in the content, earlier in this particular stream. And what that is that, okay, they don't want to put Conor in UFC 300 because they already have a bunch of title fights that they can put on that particular card, right? So it's going to make great numbers, but why share that with Conor McGregor when you can spread him out somewhere down the year, maybe even in the summertime? So all these champions can take his spot for, let's say, the springtime, and then in the summertime, well, he can go and make big numbers there and then increase the quarterly of their yearly income. So that's sort of the reason why I sort of hinted at that. But yeah, back to that video, just so you guys can get a full understanding of that context.
Education system at the time. And that's why you remember you saw a lot of DARE ads, a lot of DARE programs, and a lot of DARE videos all throughout the public schools in the 90s. But that's neither here or there. So the one thing you got to understand now with Conor McGregor is that he can't just go out and take a fight on a random fight night. This is not something that he does. Conor McGregor is also not the kind of guy that you just put out there in, let's say, a co-main event, or maybe even, let's say, a main card. Even if Conor McGregor was to go down the entire rankings of a constant losing streak that, let's say, can be compared to the likes of Tony Ferguson or BJ Penn, or maybe even Andre Arlovski in the earlier days, and into plenty of times where he's been on winning streaks as well as he's been on losing streaks. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that you got to understand about Conor McGregor is you're never going to see him have a career like Jim Miller. You're never going to see him have a career like Andre Arlovski that I had just mentioned. Nor will you see him ever have a career like Derek Chisora in boxing. Now, why is that? Why did I mention these men's names? And why did I say that Conor McGregor will never have a career like theirs? Well, for one, I got to tell you, Jim Miller has some of the most fights in the entire UFC roster. In fact, he fought in UFC 100, he fought in UFC 200, and in the upcoming UFC 300, they're going to throw him in there. So make no mistake, this is a guy who, by the way, never really reached his championship potential, but was always sliding in between the prelim cards just as easily. By the way, you want to talk about how Dustin Poirier was able to beat Conor McGregor? I'll tell you how. Because he was in matches where it didn't have to be this high elevated level of, let's say, an event, or maybe even a high level fighter all the time. You look at the list of the people that Conor McGregor has fought, it's just been nothing but killers over and over again. From Eddie Alvarez, Khabib, Jose Aldo. You can even throw Nate Diaz in there. Maybe he was a little bit better in 2016, irregardless of what you may think of him now. Nonetheless, Conor has always fought high-level competition, but the problem is he hasn't fought them at a higher rate where he can get the rounds in and have that type of career that, once again, I had mentioned it, Jim Miller has. Also, Andre Arlovski on that end, he will never have a career like that because Andre Arlovski went through winning streaks and went through losing streaks. And in between that, he got to learn a whole lot of different skills, which, by the way, even with his losing streak, he was able to learn and once again recreate new winning streaks, which, by the way, Conor, right now, he's experiencing the other end of that. Well, primarily because why? He fought the same two guys who we now found out is literally top 3, top 4 in the world in Dustin Poirier. So because of that, now we're trying to understand where Conor is. We're trying to give him a fair shake. And what do I mean by fair shake? Meaning that we want to give him continuous activity for him to reach the level that he needs to be at, or where he can potentially reach himself in terms of his prime. I mean, we saw a prime of Conor McGregor in 2016, but guess what? Why was that able to happen in that kind of way? Well, you look at the activity rate that he had back in the days. This is the reason why Conor is as good as he is back in the days, because of the activity rate that he was able to put down. And that activity rate was what led him to the Jose Aldo 15-second knockout. It is what led him to look like an absolute masterpiece when he took on Dennis Seaver. And it also gave him the high, intense preparation of taking on an all-time great such as Max Holloway early in his career. And by the way, later finding out exactly why Conor McGregor had to use wrestling against him. On top of the fact that Conor McGregor had to test himself in terms of fighting with an injury and then having to pull out a different tool in his toolbox in order to win this matchup. By the way, a highly touted MMA boxer in Max Holloway. Maybe you could say he wasn't like that at the time, but guess what? Max Holloway was always going to be Max Holloway in terms of his stand-up. And Conor McGregor at that time neutralized him by using a grappling skills that we didn't think that he had. So guess what? From that point on, it led him to a path of activity that led him to the Nate Diaz fight, winning that, but losing that in the very beginning of the year, only for him to come back and become a double champion by the end of the year.
Now, look, this is something I really have to emphasize with you guys, is that Conor McGregor may never have that type of career again. The one that I just mentioned right now, where he had a consecutive amount of activity from the Nate Diaz fight, 2 of them. One that he lost, he gets a rematch. And then out of nowhere, he gets a title shot against Eddie Alvarez and wins the double championship and looks great while doing it. No wonder, because of the fact that he had that certain level of activity that made him perform in that kind of way. But more on this.
Here in a red hot and very exciting Eddie Alvarez at the time of 2016. And when you look at that fight with Conor in 2016 against Eddie Alvarez, the one thing that I think you can really learn from that is understand what type of level Conor McGregor can reach if you give him the right amount of activity. That level of activity produced the best Conor McGregor that we've seen, that became immortalized in one of the most iconic pictures that you can find in MMA with him holding the two belts and saying to the world, I'd like to apologize to absolutely nobody. And what a beautiful way of capping that, letting the world know that he was the best man in that particular time. But times have changed. Time moves on. Just like the heavyweight division. John Jones is now the top heavyweight in the world. And yes, with one fight in heavyweight. And it was no easy task against Cyril Gane. You look at the way Francis Ngannou took him on. You can argue the asterisk of Francis having knee problems, but still, 5 rounds it took Francis Ngannou to win that fight, and he couldn't finish him. John Jones did it in 1. And now we have these situations where these guys now have a stake to the heavyweight division, right? Tom Aspinall remained active, learned through the ropes in terms of his setbacks, and then coming back. And then here he is, a champion. 1-1 champion, if you really think about it realistically, out of his 2 last fights. Okay? So, now here he is as a champion, 2-1. Very redeemable qualities. And you know what? You got to ask yourself, why was Tom Aspinall able to just go in there and jump in and do that? Well, for the reason being is because of the fact that he doesn't have a big name like Conor McGregor. I mean, does he have a big following? Sure. They had a few English guys come in there, fly in from Manchester, from London, wherever Tom Aspinall supporters are from, maybe even Ireland, maybe even Northern Ireland, Scotland, maybe even the Isle of Man, wherever in the United Kingdom where these guys were supporting Tom Aspinall, they came in at a short notice just as he did. Took time off of work, whatever it is that they do, or whatever money they saved up for maybe, I don't know, a Vegas event they wanted to get to maybe in the summer. They were like, hey, you know what? Tom's fighting in New York City. It's a lot closer and it's a lot sooner. So let's just make some arrangements. And then here they are. Okay? Easy. The problem is you can't do that with Conor McGregor because now you're going to have to talk to the different hotels that are going to be involved. You're talking about hundreds, if not just maybe thousands of Englishmen flying to go see Tom Aspinall fight. Now, let's say it's Conor McGregor. Guess what you're going to deal with? Millions upon millions of Irish that want to plan whatever party they have from around the world in order for them to set a date. Hey, Conor is fighting at this date. Let's go do something. And it's the thing to do. It's like the modern Mike Tyson thing, or WrestleMania, or maybe even the Super Bowl or the World Series. Even if Conor is not fighting for a championship, this is the type of feel that he brings to his events. But it is also the reason why he's cursed in that same fashion. He is the absolute victim and the curse of his own success. And it is unfortunate because he won't be able to learn as much as he should. He won't be able to have all the rounds that he requires, even if he starts his dudes in the first round. Let's say he gets through this Michael Chandler fight. Let's create a hypothetical scenario in the future. Okay? He beats Michael Chandler. What do we give him? Maybe what? 1 round? Could we say that? 1 round, Conor McGregor? Sound good? Does everybody agree with that? Okay.
And so the reason why I brought this up was because I just asked myself, you know what? There is a great chance that Conor McGregor could knock out Michael Chandler in the first round. The only problem is, what are you going to do after that fight? Are you going to give him the Islam Makhachev fight? Is that the right thing to do? Are you going to give him the Justin Gaethje fight, maybe a BMF title? Are you going to give him, let's say, maybe a Gamrot fight, or maybe one of these new age 155ers? That's a little bit hard to do because there's going to be some names there that are not real big names and are just not going to be lucrative for Conor McGregor to go out there and fight. Now, a lot of people always say, well, Conor McGregor can sell out an entire arena fighting a broomstick. The reality is, can he? I mean, there's very few guys in the world that can pull off something like that. Mike Tyson, I tell you, was one of those guys. He could literally fight a broomstick and the entire world would come and watch it. And lo and behold, in the 90s, it was sort of like that because he had all these one round knockout fights and they were against a lot of names that really a lot of people didn't know. I mean, there were some hardcore boxing niche names that you could sort of pull out of the hat and say, okay, you know what? I know this name or this and that, but there was a lot of names that you didn't know, especially on the way up. So I think, yeah, it's just one of those situations where it's very difficult to match a guy like him right now. But more on this video.
Highly plausible that that will happen. Obviously, I've explained in the past reasons why I think that, well, Conor McGregor has a chance of catching Michael Chandler. He puts his hands down. He's very sloppy. He likes to brawl like he's fighting street, like what Islam Makhachev say about Michael Chandler. And Conor, you can say he's a lot more crisp. Even Khabib, when he walked in the cage against Khabib was very scared of his striking, and rightfully so. Rightfully so, he was scared of his striking. So, in turn, he came in there with absolute caution. Now, if you took on somebody like Islam Makhachev and matched him up with Michael Chandler, I don't think he would have a day of respect for his striking. I think Islam Makhachev would head kick him, if not knock him out with his hands somewhere down the line of the fight. But that's Michael Chandler in a nutshell. So, yes, it's highly plausible Conor McGregor can get the knockout. Okay, after that, now what? How are you going to match him up? Where are you going to match him up against? Are you going to match him up against Islam? Okay, now see how that fight goes in terms of trying to make it. Where are they going to agree to in the venue? Okay, that's going to take a little bit of a while. Now they got to do USADA testing. Okay, maybe this is not going to fall through, or maybe Islam doesn't want to fight at this time. Maybe they want to do it around Ramadan where it's too close and it's not falling in the same time frame as Conor McGregor. Now you have the roadblocks that is inherent with what happens when you're dealing and trying to match up Conor McGregor in his whole entire career. This has been the entire story. He's just very difficult to match up because of the superstardom that he has reached. Now, why is it so easy for other guys to be matched up and not only that, fall into short notice fights straight away in ways that Conor seems to have a problem? Well, for one, you got to understand, the other guys are famous, but they're not mainstream famous. And when it comes to mainstream notoriety, it takes a lot of time in order for you to get things done. And you can name a whole bunch of reasons. I would literally have to go through an entire class of sports marketing, public relations, in and out actions, and day-to-day interactions and things of that nature. And still, it would be very difficult to try to pinpoint exactly where is it that we went wrong in terms of trying to get this guy to, let's say, a scheduled date. Okay, it's very difficult to pinpoint out because when you're dealing with somebody that owns one of the biggest liquor companies in the world now, somebody who has the biggest name in the UFC, and then somebody who has all these leverage points that he can use against the UFC in terms of negotiations, well, you're not dealing with the easiest person, on top of the fact that the man already has the biggest ego there is, which makes everything else even more difficult in terms of communication. And by the way, on a side note, this is something that a lot of people who have never experienced the corporate world or marketing or the world of, let's say, boiler room, sales room type of tactics and whatnot.
Yeah, so this is something very important to understand, right? Again, some of the biggest reasons why it's going to be very hard to once again communicate with Conor McGregor is because he has a big ego, for better or worse. And by the way, that same ego is what led him to becoming one of the greatest mixed martial arts fighters of all time, because he was only the second guy ever to win a double champion. Well, actually, the first guy ever to hold both titles at the same time, because the other guys that were winning two titles, guess what? They were doing it one at a time. So, yeah, just a little side note to kind of remember.
This is just something that you're not going to understand when it comes to dealing with egos and how that's going to affect, let's say, the dynamic of a team, the dynamic of a business, the dynamic of, let's say, the employer versus the employee relationship. A lot of these factors have to be taken in because guess what? To the mind of the casual fans, all they see is, why can't they just get these guys to fight? They think of it from the most primitive form as how you would look at, let's say, a schoolyard fight that's being arranged in your school, and you want to show face to everybody that you are the toughest guy, that you are the alpha male, and that you are the one that's not going to back down, and that you are not the P word, and this and that, and everybody has to be hard, and everybody has to show that they are the biggest macho man in the room, and all this, yada, yada. It's not like that in the real world, and you find that out real quick. You know who finds that out real quick? A lot of these young gangsters that grew up thinking that their aggression and their way of, let's say, forcing their will upon the world. And by the way, there's some good influences and good use to that in a youth. And by the way, guess who uses that? The US government and the military, in order for them to recruit people at a young age, conscript them into the military, maybe even give them higher positions later down the road if they, let's say, obtain ranking and education and things of that nature. But yes, it starts with the people that are very disillusioned when they're young. When you get older, and then when you reach the higher ranks, and then let's say even if you get to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military, or if you become the top OG of whatever organization you belong to, one thing you find out real quick is how the real world operates. And it operates in a way that is far more difficult in terms of sometimes bureaucracy, in terms of hierarchies, and sometimes even in terms of negotiation disputes and conflicts that are present in a situation that you're trying to cool down. So, those are some realities that I don't think a lot of people consider when you have this level of fame and you have this level of notoriety attached to the fact that you just want to be a fighter. You just want to be the guy that has purpose. And here's something that a lot of people have to understand, right? There's people out there that call Conor McGregor the P word because he doesn't want to fight. Okay, guess what? That's for you to decide. That's for your own subjective opinion. But you got to understand, this is a man who is yearning for a fight, but for one reason or another is not able to because of these different circumstances, which, by the way, some of them, quite frankly, to give it an equal criticism, is sort of self-induced on his end. Maybe he just didn't have the proper right amount of days in a row where he stayed healthy, stayed out of the drink, had, let's say, a training regimen that was consistent all throughout a certain amount of days and weeks. And then somewhere down the line, he cut off that chain and broke that particular set of habits that he needed to, let's say, get ready for a specific date. So maybe that's why he's not so bothered being told that, hey, you know what, you're not going to be in UFC 300 because we're going to put you out in July. And now that's an even bigger time, more of a higher training camp, longer training camp, which, by the way, sometimes can be very inconducive to preparation. as Tom Aspinall and Michael Bisping in that particular reference, because they were able to pull off this type of win and championship prowess and performance in a short amount of time with just getting a call on a short notice. Because sometimes if you have a full training camp, you may just go out there and overtrain. And this is one of the dangers that is involved with Conor McGregor going into this fight. Because now he has this situation where he could potentially overtrain. And then on top of the fact that he was very inactive and doesn't have those rounds in and could potentially go in there very rusty. Here's the thing. I used to believe that there is no such thing as ring rust. Now, the thing is, it's true to a certain extent. Dominic Cruz said this. Do I agree with Dominic Cruz on his end? Yes. I agree for his style. Tyson Fury also doesn't have ring rust, just like Dominic Cruz doesn't have ring rust. What do they both have in common? Well, one of the things they have in common is the fact that they have a very elusive fighting style. It's very loose, very fluid, very unpredictable. And maybe it lends itself to, let's say, having a higher longevity as opposed to with Conor McGregor. Yes, he is elusive, but he uses a lot of explosive shots, which in turn really requires a lot of rest from all the explosivity that you're outputting and then the recovery that you have to match as a result of it. Okay, it's just this proper ratio that just doesn't add up. And this is why when it comes to training fighters, it's never a one-size-fits-all answer. Now, I do understand there's teams out there that train together and do the same things, do the same drills, do the same workouts. And there's some benefits to this. But I say there's also higher benefits to training and understanding your own individualized pattern. And with the individualized pattern that I noticed with Conor McGregor, he requires a lot of activity in order for him to be as successful as we've potentially seen him to become. In his days of Jose Aldo, in his days of Eddie Alvarez, in his days against Nate Diaz, and in his days against maybe the future of Conor McGregor that we have yet to see in another prime form. But who knows? But for now, here's a couple of outtakes, a couple of takes that we can take from this particular content. For one, activity and lack of is going to hurt him in the long run. And number two, now we understand how this world of the fight business can be very difficult for the biggest stars in the game. And in particular, a unique case such as Conor McGregor. But that is why.
So to add to that, yes, this is a very unique case, right? We've never seen anything like this before in the world of mixed martial arts, let alone combat sports in total. What we are witnessing with Conor McGregor is a situation where his development and the development that he wishes to have is a little bit harder to come by because of the status that he has obtained. Okay, so in other words, some things that I had mentioned about, let's say, Jim Miller, for example, I said Jim Miller is one of the highest in terms of fights. He has the most fights in the UFC, right? So that's somewhere in the 30s, maybe even in the 40s now. And you look at Jim Miller, he's a highly developed fighter and a veteran. And maybe you can argue he's not a world championship fighter. Obviously, he's never had a world title. but he was able to develop over the years because he was in matches that were just really not a big deal in the way that you had to have when you're Conor McGregor. You see, with Conor, it's a lot more complicated than just going in there to fight. You see, with Conor McGregor, you got to bring the fiasco, you got to bring the circus. On top of that, you also got to understand Conor McGregor sort of brought this upon himself. You see, what the guy brought onto himself was this world of people that were going to follow him to every move that he does from the minute that he's training to the minute that he steps into the cage. Now, this is a very difficult fight. I'm sorry, this is a very difficult life to lead, especially as a high level mixed martial arts fighter. And by the way, for anybody that's been a hardcore fan in the old days, you know that all these new profound fame that these fighters are now getting is very foreign to the mixed martial arts community that you would understand from the tap out or affliction days. Right or wrong, write on the comments below if you agree with that or disagree with that. But I will say that in the days of Jason Mayhem Miller, you could say that he was one of the first superstars in the world of professional mixed martial arts. Obviously, if you guys remember the Bully Beatdown show back in the days, he was the host of that. And not only that, the guy was featured in a lot of different reality shows. I believe that he did do an Ultimate Fighter show eventually when he signed with the UFC to go out and fight Michael Bisping. So he was one of the first superstars in MMA. But guess what? Jason Mayhem Miller can walk around, by the way, a place that is no strangers to celebrities and well known figures in LA and just not be recognized, right? He just looked like anybody else that was living in Southern California. And that goes with a lot of fighters too. I mean, obviously, there were some rare exceptions like Chuck Liddell. He was an absolute icon in the sport, very recognizable. He had a very unique look about him, which made him a unicorn in that. So, but the type of fame that Conor McGregor has right now, it is absolutely unnatural to the sport of mixed martial arts. And what do I mean by that? Look, no lie. I'm a kid that grew up in the 90s watching 1980s martial arts flicks. Okay. If you are from that era, and the way that you understand martial arts, you never understood martial arts to be this sport that was going to somehow give you Joe Montana fame or Michael Jordan fame. It just isn't that type of mainstream sport, is it? It's not that type of world. So if you were part of that world, even as just a fan, or maybe as just a casual observer, or perhaps maybe one of the few people in the world that has studied jujitsu at that particular time, guess what? You're sort of okay with understanding where this sport is in the world in terms of being a niche reality, right? It's not a mainstream thought, nor is it a common way of life for a lot of people, unless, of course, if you're the Russians or Dagestanis that have had Sambo their whole entire existence, even the ties with the Muay Thai and whatnot. But yeah, that's neither here or there. So
I'm going to segue this away from Conor and the attention to the upcoming fighters that are in this new generation. You have to appreciate them for that reason. You got to appreciate Tom Aspinall because he is in a position where he can still take these short notice fights. And you can only hope that if he ever reaches the level of the Jorge Masvidal and the Conor McGregors of the world, that he will continue this pattern. Because guess who did? Israel Adesanya. And you know what? He paid dearly for it. He got all the activities in the world. You look at his stats, all the different UFC events that he's headlined, that all coincide with his title fights. It's a huge number. I can't bring the number off the top of my head right now, but I remember seeing a meme of all these different UFC card numbers that he was involved in, and I said to myself, wow, this is an absolutely staggering stat. I remember all these numbers too. Some of these have very familiar names or numbers attached to them. like the one that he had with Paulo Costa back in the UFC 250s. I believe it was UFC 251 or no, 252, because 251, I believe, was just right before, right during the Jorge Masvidal and the first Usman fight. But yeah, you also got to remember Conor was able to take these short notice fights back in the days as well. This is how he was able to get that Chad Mendes fight. This is how he was able to just jump in cards and fights with absolutely no problem. So you got to think, in 2016, he was quite active right before he stumbled on the Floyd fight. He fought Nate in March. Prior to that, he just won the title in December. And then December of 2015, by the way. So December 2015, and then March against Nate, he lost, got choked, came back in the summer of August, went to a decision, and then in November, went in with Eddie Alvarez. Very consistent with his activity level. Very consistent. And you saw the results of it. But after that Floyd Mayweather fight, it seemed that Conor McGregor was at the point of no return. He was at a point where now we just realized we can't just put this guy in cards out of nowhere. And guess what? The buildup had to be even bigger. It had to escalate even more, which is the reason why he did what he did in the Khabib fight. Now, you can say that Conor McGregor is a psychopath. You see all the anti-Islamic rhetoric that he throws at Usman when he supposedly failed some sort of dietary issue or whatever, right? Not so much of a performance drug of any kind, but it's one of those technicalities where he had a condition, a doctor gave him prescription, but either way, Conor McGregor uses it to throw shade at their lack of Islamic practice, or what he perceives Khabib and his team to hold some sort of level of hypocrisy in their practice of Islam, which in and of itself can be offensive to some people. But again, it's the reason why the guy is as famous as he is because he knows how to draw up interest. He knows how to draw controversy. And here we are with Conor McGregor doing exactly that. And by the way, what is the proof of this? If we can't really speculate one way or the other, me just giving you a subjective opinion of whether the guy really is an Islamophobe, he mentions to Khabib during a fight, hey, it's just business. It's just business. A business that, by the way, he's very good at, in a business that he has mastered. Mastered to the point where it is now impending on his development in the latter stages of his career. I got to tell you, Conor McGregor's entire career is a lot like the UFC 4 video game career mode. Not just the UFC 4, obviously the new one out now that is 5, and then prior to that was 3. But so when you're in these training camps on career mode, and this relates to Conor McGregor, by the way, you either have to choose to have the highest popularity or the highest fight hype for your matchup, or concentrate on developing your skills. And guess what? You can experiment all throughout these career modes in these video games to see what is more conducive to whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Do you want more pay-per-view sales? Do you want more cash for your video game points? Okay, then go with the popularity. Do you want to be the most elite fighter and the most well-rounded fighter and give 5 stars to all your attributes? Or do you just want the fight hype and all the attention and all the views that you get in the imaginary social media world that is created within the career mode? So these are some of the choices that you have. You either can be the most popular, or you can either be the most skilled fighter. And guess what? This is the dilemma that Conor McGregor is experiencing in this current moment of time. He wants to be a highly developed fighter, but how can he do that without the activity, on top of the fact that he's just really recovering from a bad accident that he had in the Dustin Poirier fight? And then on top of that, he's the most popular fighter in the world, if not one of the most popular men on the planet. And that in and of itself is becoming a problem in his developmental stages as an evolving fighter that he wants to be in the latter stages of his career. And in particular, an age where, to be fair and to be honest, statistically speaking, within his weight class, many men start dwindling down.
Yeah. So an interesting thing about that, I saw a meme about Justin Gaethje where he says that, yeah, today Justin Gaethje turns 35 years old, and according to this statistic, his chances of ever winning a UFC title are now over. And I think Conor McGregor is sort of in that same field, right? But then again, you got to ask yourself, is his whole entire intention really to go out there and win belts, or just go out there and be in super fights in big pay-per-view events with other big names that really don't have a lot of title implications other than just having a fun old fight? I think that he's sort of secure in his career right now where he can just take those types of fights. And this isn't really far-fetched from what Connor has mentioned in the past when he mentions that I'm going to adjust my competition as I get older, sort of like what you do in jiu-jitsu when you have the masters division, where you just have other mid 30s guys and guys that are in their 40s and 50s duke it out, rather than having them go out there and take on, let's say, somebody of a higher belt caliber on top of a younger age, and differences of those ratios that are just a mismatch. But I think he understands where he's at in that. But once again, I really wanted to bring up that metaphor that I mentioned about the career mode, because, yeah, you have one way of handling your career in terms of getting all the hype and getting all the attention. But then the other side of it, sort of this situation where you'd rather just be the most well rounded beast of a fighter that you can be, never mind all the attention and notoriety that comes with it.
Which is, by the way, maybe the reason why John Kavanaugh is hinting that he is only going to fight at 170 and perhaps only fight these super fights where he can fight at a higher weight and not really fight for, let's say, a 155 bout without trying to accomplish some sort of 155 title aspiration. But that's the reality of Conor McGregor in today's video. So hopefully, I hope I explained all the best details that I can in terms of the business side and the psychological side of him being as a fighter. And by the way, this is another thing I wanted to mention about Conor McGregor, right? He has all the money in the world. Some say just retire, go chill. But guess what? You also got to understand, some guys are not just doing this for money. And by the way, if you want to just go within the subject of money, in all honesty, it is one of the worst things in the world when you don't have the money to pay your bills and to be able to provide anything, right? It is the worst thing in the world. However, if you're out of that rut and you're in a situation where you have enough financial freedom to have the choice of doing what you want to do on a daily basis, it becomes a whole different battle. Now the battle is purpose, which is why you see a lot of rich people go into philanthropy. Perhaps a feeling of guilt that they are making so much money in a world that is ever growing in destitution, or they just genuinely have a good heart and want to do it for the sake of Allah. Either way, the one thing you got to understand about life and people's motivations that are not motivated by, let's say, the duress of destitution or poverty, is that every man looks for purpose. And by the way, before you have purpose, you also got to understand there is only so much money that you can truly have where happiness just doesn't affect any more or anything less 1 cent over or $1 over or $1 less than the other. In other words, there was an article a few years ago where they mentioned that having $70,000 more than that doesn't make you any happier. And I thought about that and it made sense because if you are at a certain tax bracket, especially in the middle class, never mind the upper middle class, okay, there's a certain level of financial freedom that you can feel, that you can enjoy. But also with that, anything above more than that really doesn't change anything about your inner voids or lack of purpose in life or lack of lack of lack of purpose, right? Like, okay, what I'm really trying to say, sorry about that, just so almost lost my train of thought there. What I'm trying to say is that when it comes to money, there's only a minimum that can keep you happy, and anything more than that is really just a bonus and sometimes even just a burden. That's the reality of it. It's a burden. But sometimes happiness really is not about money so long as you have the basic minimum in life, which, by the way, I just mentioned is what? According to that article, it's $70,000. You have that, it's almost like you have everything else in the world. Everything else more than that is just out of your ego and greed and sense of wanting to obtain a higher status or notoriety of some sort. But other than that, yes, this is a true essence of happiness, is purpose. And when you don't have that, money and fame means nothing. And that's literally, I think, what Conor McGregor is finding out right now. That money and fame mean absolutely nothing because his purpose is being taken away from him. Of course, he's never going to have to worry about bills for the rest of his life. Of course, he's never going to have to worry about paying XA to XB or whatever it is that you people worry about on a.
All right. So if you want to check out the rest of that video, obviously the title is right there on the comment that I just highlighted right on the screen. But yeah, so again, I also saw a news article somewhere circulating online where they mentioned that Conor McGregor is open to boxing Jake Paul sometime down the road. By the way, this is from one of his managers that had mentioned this. So make of that as you will. The point of the matter is that let's take a look at Jake Paul in that particular aspect, right? I mean, this is a kid who was already rich. He already had everything that he wanted. He had already accomplished more than what most people could accomplish in their lifetime that he did in his early 20s. Yet, just before his mid 20s, he decided to become a boxer. And you got to ask yourself, well, what's the motivation behind that? What is your plan in doing something like that? Well, obviously, it's not about the money, right? Obviously, there's people out there that box because they want to get out of poverty. Same thing in MMA, same thing in all combat sports. This is just a common theme all throughout history. The thing is, he wanted to do it to serve a purpose in himself. Now, you can call that a useless purpose, being that you're going to deduct it in your own worldview and trying to understand it from, well, why would you need to go out there and prove you're the baddest man in the room if you have all the money in the world? Well, I tell you what, it's just not something that a lot of people that are not athletic driven or competitive driven are just going to understand. So make of that as you will, right? So he wants to prove himself. He got into the boxing ring, started beating a whole bunch of ex MMA fighters or ex MMA champions at that, and made a name for himself as somebody that is somewhat of a legitimate tough guy and not somebody that is playing one in a movie or in a TV screen just for whatever sake and purpose that he's trying to portray that message. In other words, real men are fulfilled by accomplishing goals and going through adventures and everything that revolves around that. So the fact that Conor McGregor is being hindered from his life, right? Because let's be honest, this is a guy that is willing to stay active. You look at the Chad Mendes fight that he did back in 2015. He had a broken foot in that one. You could even say that he had a broken foot in the Khabib fight as well. He still went in there. Another thing I really noticed was that in the midst of the UFC 229 fight, right? And I'm going back into Conor McGregor's documentary that he did for Netflix. Obviously, we knew about the UFC 229 fight. We knew the whole entire fiasco and the circus that revolved around that entire event. What we didn't know was the backstage emotions that Conor had showed after the fight. Dana said, "Hey, it was one of those one of Khabib's guys that sucker punched you, huh?" He sort of shot down that question straight away because he just really wanted to emphasize his disappointment in the loss that he had against Khabib that night, because ultimately that's all that it really mattered. He said to Khabib that night, "Yeah, it's just business," but by the end of the day, he really meant it in a sense where he's just in there competing a sport, regardless of the fact that he was happy about getting the final blow of the night, as he had mentioned in the Tony Robbins podcast. He mentioned something to the effect where, yeah, I had the final blow of that night, but then you watch the Netflix documentary, it doesn't seem to be what really matters. Because what really matters to the highly competitive athlete, and this goes with Kobe Bryant as well. Obviously, he went through a lot of years dominating the entire sport. He was already rich from the get go, even from his just rookie year alone, and yet he continued competing. Same with a lot of these other guys that are in these mainstream sports. What is it that continues to drive them? Same thing with Ronaldo, same thing with Messi. Now that Messi is a World Cup champion after he became one from his country of Argentina, winning it in the Qatar World Cup of 2022. What else is left? He's still out there. He's still trying to win European titles. He's still trying to win Champions League titles, maybe even a Premier League title if he goes out and plays in England. So, but again, we're talking about a completely different sport, right? But still, the motivations are all the same. And that's one thing that we have to try to really take from this, right? Conor wants to show that he is the baddest man in the world. And the one thing you got to understand about that is the one thing that money can never buy. And ultimately, the things that money can't buy are the things that the richest people out there are always going to want to be in search of. So this is why you think to yourself, why is Mark Zuckerberg out there training while getting injured, and yet he is a billionaire? Does he even have to do this? And the answer is no, he doesn't. But ultimately, that is the beauty of this sport. Don't forget to like and subscribe.